Um, and today we're going to try not to have a fire hose of information, but you know how it is with the two of us. So just know that if you have questions, write them for us. We'll be together a lot during the week. And the one thing I want to say, one theme is, as we're talking about all these hormones, one of the things that we're really focused on in October is is the detoxing of our hormones and making sure that we keep, whether we're taking hormones or we're not taking hormones, but that we're in really good shape to detox our hormones and keep our body in the best shape possible, keep our hormone levels in the just right doses, just right amounts. That's the Goldilocks rule that we talk about. Not too much, not too little, just right. And that's kind of where we're coming from. But we're on to progesterone.
And it's a female hormone symphony is what we call this, because it really is a network of hormones in the body that all work together. They're totally interconnected and they're working all over. There's every single cell. They're working in your GI system. They're working all over the place. We went through brain when we did our brain series. But it just goes further beyond the reproductive system, this talk about progesterone too. So I just want to make sure that we're trying to bring in the big players. So today we're thinking, okay, thyroid and progesterone are so linked. Many of you who are on here today and were on yesterday have thyroid issues in addition. So we just want to talk about progesterone and its big role here and what happens, especially during perimenopause. In our culture, we just talk about, oh, estrogen goes away. But the hidden thing is that progesterone goes away first, because progesterone is made in your ovary. And as your ovaries get older, and they actually do age and they get damaged by our environment, by aging process, the cells that make progesterone are damaged and they don't make as much progesterone. So one of the first things you see is that progesterone can go low first. So we just want to talk about what are the key things, Hillary, that women would notice with progesterone going a little lower?
When progesterone's starting to dive, and this is typically for women in their 40s, and it can be for women that are younger that have thyroid issues, or that have things like I have PCOS. So like there are some conditions that are set up to have terrible progesterone all the way through. So like a PCOS woman like me, like I needed a lot of progesterone in order to get pregnant. And we tend to have thyroid issues. But in the 40s, what's happening is just that when you ovulate, the egg's not quite as badass. It's not releasing as much progesterone. And so some things will show up where women could, and this is the really fun thing. It's so different for every woman, kind of based on her liver and her detox pathways. But in general, women, as their progesterone's coming off, are going to have sleep issues. In general, women are going to not sleep as well. They're going to be waking up at night. They're going to be, whether they're sweaty at night or hot at night, like they're waking, and they're usually waking around 3 to 4 to 5 a.m. They're having a hard time falling asleep. And this will be the women that are like, I never used to have a hard time falling asleep. And now I'm just, or I'm anxious, I'm ruminating, I'm thinking about things. I can't make decisions as easily. I'm just anxious. Something feels off. Some women will have, their cycle will get shorter. So they'll be like, whoa, I'm getting my period every 22 days. Like, what's going on with that? Some women, it will be extended. So it always takes a bit of detective work. There's not like a total checklist, but often what happens, it was like Kara describing herself walking into the doctor yesterday. What happens when we start to notice our progesterone's not as badass or as robust as it should be is that we go into the doctor and we're like, something's just not right. I can't quite figure it out. Like I'm snappy, I'm a little bit more anxious, I'm like not really handling stuff as well. I'm irritable, I'm not sleeping at night. And this is why you can see it's so easy for the provider to go, oh, well, you're probably depressed and you need a sleep aid. Or you might be anxious and you need a sleep aid, because it's truly, that's the way she's presenting. But it's not because she's having a serotonin deficiency, though her serotonin is totally impacted by the progesterone, right? It's not wrong. It's just choosing the wrong why. They're fixing the wrong why. The why is that we have one of our main hormones declining, and that can create what's called an estrogen dominance. So this is always the interesting thing when we talk about hormones. As we get into our perimenopause, menopause years, the hormones in general are declining, but it can create this, like, if this is estrogen and this is progesterone, progesterone can decline first. So it creates this estrogen dominance. Estrogen's less than it was in her 30s. So she's having some estrogen deficiency symptoms, but she's also having some estrogen dominant symptoms. So it's this really interesting, changeable, fun if you think it's fun, time in our lives where we get to go, okay, what's showing up? And this is a really fun time where we get to journal and get in touch with our bodies, right? Like, what's happening? And it's sometimes we'll have a friend call us out, or if you're my boyfriend was calling me out, like, just so you know, like, 3 days before every period, you want to like end our relationship and you want to move and change jobs. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so misogynistic. Da 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 da. My period has nothing to do with it. He's like, no, 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 with love. 3 days before every cycle for the last 2 years, and you're like, oh, okay, it's because I need to support my progesterone, right? And women are just riding through the waves. And sometimes it takes an outside source to be like, just so you know, this is happening to you. And it does really cause us stress, mind, body, spirit.
Okay, I want to ask you about luteal phase deficiency, because when we work in fertility, and people are trying to regulate their menstrual cycles, I think that phrase came out in the 90s or early 2000s, a luteal phase deficiency. I think that might help people understand what you're talking about as far as hormones go.
Progesterone is high in the luteal phase. Our menstrual cycles pretty much divided into follicular phase, the growing of things. That's when estrogen's really strong. We're growing the thickness of the lining of our uterus so that a darling embryo can implant and grow. And that's what's considered the follicular phase. Once ovulation, estrogen peaks, that's creates what's called an LH surge. Ovulation happens, and then we enter the luteal phase. And once ovulation happens, the estrogen slowly will decline the second part of the cycle, and then progesterone's rising because the corpus luteum, which is part of the egg, is releasing progesterone. So when you have a luteal phase deficiency, that means in the second part of your cycle, you're not making enough progesterone. And you can show up with things like fertility issues, um, short cycle, believe it or not, a long cycle, because the rise and then the fall of progesterone is what creates our menstrual cycle.
Mhm.
But it can show up as a lot of anxiety. There can be digestive issues. Some people can have flu-like symptoms kind of right before their period if they have luteal phase deficiencies. There's an estrogen dominance. Thyroid issues can cause luteal phase issues, and luteal phase issues can cause thyroid problems in autoimmunity. So these things all kind of work together. But in general, women with luteal phase deficiencies have janky periods. They're not the women that are like, I'm 28 days, perfect to the boo. And they generally have some sleep issues. They generally feel a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah,
Um,
that sums it up. That's perfect. Okay, so I think it's really cool to recognize that these ovaries are about the size of an almond, just tiny little, they're like the size of an almond. And once that egg flies off, and it's this very robust thing, it like bursts off the ovary. The
we made
cells,
a really funny slide of it once where it was like fireworks. Like,
we had like an animation cool thing that was amazing. But it fires off like like a firecracker. It's gone. And it's the cells that are left there that's called the corpus luteum. Those are the cells that make progesterone. So if your ovaries aren't functioning properly and you're not ovulating, you just don't make as much progesterone. So that's just really basic, really good thing to know, and makes a lot of sense. As you get older, of course, you're not going to have as much. Okay, now, Hillary, what is the so-called progesterone steal, and why is that important? Because I feel like you and I work a lot on this thing. This progesterone steal we're working in most of our patients
This
on.
is my life. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So, and then let's just in the chat, there's a really good question to
Okay.
check. Um, the progesterone steal is basically one of the molecules that can work against us is cortisol. And cortisol is made by the adrenal gland. It's a badass hormone that should be come to with mad reverence and respect, because it's the thing that gets you up, gets you going, gets your list organized, gets your brain focused, gets you functioning. And it generally should be very big in the morning. You should wake and rise with a good amount of cortisol, and then it should wane at night. And it should be in all the right amount. So with love, hormones should always be part of the Goldilocks rule, not too much, not too little. So if we say cortisol 4 times around our phones, we're going to hear all the bad things about cortisol on your Instagram reels, because cortisol gets a super bad rap, but it does so much for us. Where it gets dysregulated is when I'm freaking out that my daughter's going to be late to school. And so I'm acting like some kind of great grand devastation is going to happen. And I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off. And then I forget my lunch because I'm stressed, and I'm running around and I'm doing this and I'm doing and I get there and I'm having like a cortisol surge because my adrenal gland doesn't know if I'm actually being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or if I'm just late for school. And we get, over time, the stress that we have in our lives as women from early onset. So this can happen with early adverse childhood events or traumas or different things. And then just the daily rub of our lives and challenge of our lives creates this really screwed up cortisol pattern. So when my cortisol is high, like I'm running from the saber-toothed tiger, not really, just late in traffic or stuck in traffic and like stressed for no reason, it's stealing my progesterone, because the molecules are made, the body's trying to synthesize more cortisol and it's stealing from progesterone. That's called the progesterone steal. So it can worsen a luteal phase defect. And progesterone has many counterbalancing influences on the cortisol. Progesterone is a neurorelaxant. So if you see a woman that's like 3 months, they're in her third trimester before she starts really stressing about her birth, she's pretty chill. Like there's very little that you can do to just derail a later phase pregnant lady. Like she's just like, cool, that's fine, great, whatever. And that's because she's being flooded by huge amounts of progesterone. The progesterone is protective for our breast tissue, it's protective for our brain, it's protective for just our nervous system in general. So what we don't want is this steal to be happening, and that we're living with this low level of progesterone. And somebody asked, can you say more about thyroid and progesterone? So what can happen? Everything here could be a chicken or an egg, just so you know, right? Like, so if you're having, say you're living a really stressful life, you're having a lot of high cortisol, you're creating a luteal phase issue, what can happen next is your thyroid can start to get a little funky. Hashimoto's can happen, autoimmune stuff, because the brain's just trying its very best to make things regular again, to make it so you can have a baby. That's what the brain's trying to do, really. And so the brain's like, okay, thyroid, do more. Okay, it's trying to be the conductor in a system that's kind of dysregulated. So that's why some women will experience Hashimoto's or some other thyroiditis or thyroid issues during perimenopause, during this natural hormone decline, because the symphony's kind of out of whack.
So I think that's a really good point about if this is this female hormone symphony, this network of hormones, then we will pull pathways in one way and detract them in another way. So you can make more of something or make less of something depending on the checks and balances that the body has set up for all of these hormones. So it's this very closely regulated, pretty incredible system that we have so many things that can work in this system. And so somebody is asking, what's the solution for low cortisol? It's a very simple question, right? But the answer is never one thing. So there's not like one solution for low cortisol. It really has to be taken into account, like the human being that this is happening in. And definitely chronic stress is one of the things that contributes there. So that would be something that we would have to really look at. And you would have to look at the whole hormone symphony of like what's happening with low cortisol. Like, are the hormones being pulled other ways? Are we using the cortisol to make something else? What's happening? So it's a bigger question than, there's one solution there. But it is important, if you know you have low cortisol, to try and fix it. Hillary, can progesterone rise and fall multiple times during the luteal phase? That's a question here. And I'll just throw in, while you're about to answer that, we have had some data that very often, more often than we think, women will ovulate twice in a cycle now. So that's an interesting thing to notice. So all of these things are flexible, is what's great about the menstrual cycle.
The progesterone can have a peak and then a dip and then another peak. In many women, fertility tracking will see that. Generally, once you've kind of rounded the corner past 45, 46, you're going to see just lower levels, not two peaks. But uh, that can happen. So I love this question. How do we know which came first? The luteal phase issue, low progesterone, or cortisol stealing? How do we know? It's like, this is where we as clinicians and as like the understanding our life, where it comes, where we're trying to hear our story. So Kara and I always talk about our hormone journeys because they're totally different and we need really different treatments. We both had luteal phase defects for different reasons. Mine was because I was an overstressor, made too much testosterone. Hers was because she was estrogen dominant, and is genetically set up to kind of produce and keep too much estrogen around. One of the things that we're trying to get everybody fired up from, one of the great regulators of all hormone challenges, is, like Kara said before, stress management. So that's like, sounds so stupid, stress management, but that's just creating a good, fun, awesome life for yourself. Regardless, these things are to be supported. And then another thing is just detox and liver soothing. And one of the great big things that's in charge of all of it is our liver. And so we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow. We'll all make a tea tomorrow for us, with that, or maybe Friday if I'm at my office tomorrow. One of the great liver supporters to help soothe some of these issues. But right now, we just want you to start to think about, tomorrow we're going to talk about low estrogen. We want you to start to think about, do I potentially have a luteal phase defect? Am I having sleep issues? Am I having anxiety? Am I showing up more like staccato than I used to be in my regular life? And what are ways that I can treat that? And we'll kind of come up with some of those solutions a little later in the week. If you work out really hard, does that increase cortisol? Is it bad? It can really increase your cortisol. It's not bad if you're balanced and regular and doing great. It can feel great on your body. If you're fatigued, exhausted, just got over COVID, have Lyme disease, you just lost a parent, it could be too much. So it comes in waves. Women generally who feel badass and strong and who feel great after their workouts, it's great. If you feel depleted for a day after your hard workout, it's because it is the cortisol issue. It jacked you up. So you can always just get yourself feedback how that is. Okay, you guys, tomorrow's all about estrogen, and send your questions in. We know we're fire hosing info with you. And we are really excited to keep talking hormones with you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.